Okay, last video for today. We're just going to evaluate the revolutions of 1848 and ask the question, why do they all seem to fail, right? Actually, if we go back to one of our first discussions from this chapter, you could really argue that the most successful liberal revolution that takes place during this period is in Greece, right? This one was largely supported by the other countries in the concert of Europe, and it doesn't seem to be the case that this liberalism is going to kind of catch on among these other countries' governments. Some governments kind of entertain the idea of liberalism at first, and then if it kind of goes in a more radical direction, they turn away from it. You saw in Germany that Frederick William at first seemed like he was going to give something to the liberals by allowing the Frankfurt Assembly to meet, but then ultimately rejected its constitution, right? You saw in France, eventually the electorate just decided to turn more towards conservatism by electing Louis Napoleon as president, and then they allowed him to become emperor. So some of these failures of um, of these revolutions were actually kind of a result of the people themselves. So why is that? And what you're going to see is that increasingly liberal Democrats are going to kind of be swept out of Europe. To a certain extent, you're going to see them start to fear the more radical nature of either liberalism or radicalism. But at the same time, you are going to see that there are lasting results in these revolutionary movements. Most notably, the fact that socialism and Marxism are going to continue to be widespread ideologies throughout Europe as well as the United States up until the early 20th century. Of course, the ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels are going to continue to be widely influential. And also, you're going to see that even if conservative governments prevail in the mid 19th century, this does not mean that they are not going to have to be somewhat responsive to a liberal or socialist population. They are occasionally going to have to heed to the demands of these more radical social classes, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But in a little bit more detail, why do the revolutions fail? Well, part of it is because they do not successfully attract popular support from the working classes, that in many of these countries, the revolutions of 1848 largely are members of the working class. Like the Frankfurt Assembly, we know was large. Did I say working class? I meant to say middle class. So the working classes are not really supporting the revolutions of 1848 because they are largely being controlled by the middle class. I meant to say middle class. They're also largely urban in nature. And so why would that lead to a failure of the revolution? I mean, basically this means that when you get into the countryside, people who own land and also peasants, they are not really interested in the revolutions. When these ideas kind of reach their direction, a lot of times they are very resistant to the idea of these changes. Particularly, of course, conservative landowners are not going to be in favor of something like universal suffrage. So because the revolutions don't really catch on throughout the entire countryside and just the urban areas, they're not going to be very successful. In fact, oftentimes people in the countryside kind of look at these revolts taking place in the cities and they're kind of horrified by them. You're also going to see that the middle class, at first, they lead the revolutions, but they initially had support from the working class, right? But the working class, when they kind of take a little bit more of a radical direction in what they want from the government. This causes the middle class to kind of hold back, right? So, for example, Louis Blanc's radical ideas in France cause a lot of the middle class to be sort of scared of the possibility of a return to like the Committee of Public Safety during the French Revolution. So ultimately, you're going to see that a lot of times the middle class is going to kind of pull back. And in the case of France, we saw in the April elections, ultimately they're going to vote for mostly conservative representatives into the National Assembly then. Also, you're going to see that in terms of nationalism, a lot of times it's more divided than united. So in other words, think about Austria again. Think about the fact that there's such a division among ethnic groups throughout the Austrian Empire. This is going to make it so that no one revolutionary movement is really going to be successful. Um, Basically these different ethnicities, if they try to revolt against the empire, they are going to be squashed by the significant military of the empire overall. You saw that the Austrian Empire was easily able to solicit the help of Prussia and Russia to put down the Hungarian revolt, for example. So, basically you see that because, there are nationalist movements, but they're kind of smaller in scale, that they're never able to successfully overcome a much larger government. But at the same time, you are going to see some kind of long-term gains from the revolutions of 1848. So, in France specifically, you saw universal suffrage, right? So, this is a huge, huge kind of turn towards a more democratic government in France. You also are going to see that serfdom is going to remain abolished in Austria and the German states. So, obviously, this is a huge gain um, for kind of more social equality in these countries. Although at the same time, again, you're going to see, a largely conservative government continue in Austria and the German states until you get closer to unification in 1870. Um, Also, you're going to see parliaments established in Prussia and other German states. So, this is a turn away from a very strong monarchy, but at the same time, these parliaments are dominated by princes and aristocrats, so they're going to be pretty conservative in nature. Um, Also, another really long-term effect is that you're going to see that Prussia in particular, as well as Sardinia and Piedmont in Italy, are going to kind of emerge with like this newfound energy to move towards unification within the next 2 decades. So focusing on Prussia specifically, because we didn't talk about Italy too much at all really, but we will talk about Italy when we get to unification in a future chapter. What's important to realize with Prussia in particular here is that even though the attempts to unify Prussia fail, the idea of unification still remains. That there, of course, is a continued kind of um, uh, kind of push both from liberals and conservatives to unify the country because of the strength that it will bring to the state, the military, the economy. The problem was agreeing to a constitution that would allow unification. So, I mean, in a way, Frederick William might have been better off just agreeing to the constitution that the Frankfurt Assembly had provided, because now you're going to see it's going to take quite a while for Prussia ultimately to unify. Um, so basically, the reason why it fails to unify is because Frederick William wanted the government to be more conservative, but Austria resisted that and basically wanted to continue to be the strongest influence over the German Confederation. Maybe if before Frederick William tried to unify Prussia on his own, if he had just accepted the Constitution by the Frankfurt Assembly, we might have seen a unified Germany much sooner. So basically, what we see is that in 1848, a lot of the liberal revolutions that had begun in France all the way back in 1789, they're going to kind of come to a close here. And you're going to see a lot of stability in Europe up until the outbreak of World War One. One major exception to that, we'll talk about the Austro-Prussian War in a future chapter. But ultimately, we're going to see that these revolutions, you could really simplify them and say that they result in failure. But again, there are some positive elements in terms of getting rid of uh, serfdom, in terms of expanding the electorate, in terms of kind of continuing this kind of nationalist sentiment towards unification, particularly in Prussia and Italy. So overall, you can see that even though it seems like conservative forces had triumphed, things ultimately had changed forever. You're going to see that there are still going to be challenges to the ruling order no matter what. So even though we're turning in a more conservative direction, again, the ruling order is going to have to kind of listen to some of the economic and social demands of the entire population. The conservatives, even though they're in power, they do have to make concessions to stay in power. So it doesn't mean that they are like dictatorial in nature. You're also going to see, again, a lot of liberal achievements are going to remain permanent. So now we have greater electorates, we have some more, we're moving more in the direction of constitutions in a lot of these countries. So ultimately, we are, even though it seems like a turn towards conservatism, there are some liberal gains that we cannot deny took place during this period. Next time, we'll talk about the Romantic era and how this also plays into the 1848 revolutions.